I want to welcome everyone to our symposium on everyday forms of digital activism and resistance. My name is Guobin, and I direct the Center on Digital Culture and Society here at the Annenberg School for Communication and University of Pennsylvania. Really want to give warm welcome to all the speakers who have come far and wide. I'm very grateful to you all because you have to go through all this hassle of traveling, all the hardships of travel nowadays. I hope Philly has been treating you well so far. The weather could be a little better, I suppose, but it's a good season. So the theme of our symposium, Everyday Forms of Digital Activism and Resistance, we chose it for two reasons mainly. One is that the field of social movement studies has mainly built its theories on the basis of large-scale protest and revolutionary activities. There are not many theoretical resources for the study of mundane forms of activism. Not until recent years, though, and our three keynote speakers and many of our presenters here are among those who have made important contributions to our understanding of everyday forms of activism. So this symposium is, in that sense, an opportunity to take stock of exciting new research on everyday forms of activism. The other reason is we think of this as an occasion to celebrate the experiences of individuals and communities who are engaged in mundane forms of activism. Many of these experiences are not recognized as activism. They often remain invisible in a society of spectacle. Yet, mundane civic experiences are the fabric of community and solidarity. Many such experiences entail personal struggles for recognition against discrimination. Our symposium speakers will bring to us stories of these everyday experiences, and I'm grateful to you all for sharing your work. I'd like to thank the Annenberg staff who have worked hard to make our symposium possible. They are from many departments of the school: the dean's office, security and housekeeping, communications, events, finance, IT. I won't mention all of them. I'd like to acknowledge, though, one person sitting right here, Edwin, who is from our IT department and who is here to provide on-site support. Thank you, Edwin, for all your support. I also like to thank our CDCS organizing team, two of our postdoctoral fellows, Jun Liu and Mohammed Rashid. They worked with me to select the speakers from more than 80 submissions that we received. We had an open call for submissions, if you remember. Seems to be a long time ago. I want to thank our joint CARG and CDCS postdoctoral fellow, Sandeep Murtier, thank you, and our CDCS doctoral fellows, Sim Gill, Devo Provo, Toby Moses, for serving as our moderators for tomorrow's panels. CDCS Administrative Coordinator Chuan Dan, where is Chuan? She's probably outside, sitting there. Chuan has spent much of the past few months planning and preparing for today's symposium, and she made all the hotel and flight travel arrangements for our speakers, as well as our receptions, our meals and coffee breaks, and so on and so forth. So without Chuan's support, this is just not possible. So I want to thank Chuan for her support. Switching to our keynote speeches for today, I will briefly introduce Jingyi and Mohammed, who will then introduce our keynote speakers. Mohammed earned his PhD in Arts, Technology, and Emerging Communication from the University of Texas at Dallas. He studies Bangladeshi digital media cultures. During his fellowship here, Mohammed has been working on his book project entitled Mediated Sexualities, which contributes to ongoing conversations around queer Asia through its study of public and enclave digital media engagements of Bangladeshi LGBTQ+ communities.
And it is now my great honor to welcome Dr. Jun Liu. Dr. Jun Liu is an associate professor at the Center for Tracking and Society and the Department of Communication at the University of Copenhagen, Denmark. His research spans political sociology, digital technologies, and comparative and computational social science. His latest research outcome includes a monograph titled Shifting Dynamics of Contention in the Digital Age, published by Oxford University Press. He is currently leading a 4-year research project funded by the Independent Research Fund Denmark Research Leader Scheme on a comparative study of digital technologies and political contention in the United States, European Union, and China. We are really glad that Dr. Liu is here with us today, presenting his keynote titled The Dynamics of Everyday Politics, Blind Spots and Opportunities in Understanding Activism. Please join me, everyone, in welcoming Dr. Jun Liu.
Okay, first thanks Ashley for this very impressive talk. This extremely inspiring and I learned very much from the talk. And also I think thank Mohammed for the kind and generous introduction. So it's very nice to meet you all, and I would also like to extend my gratitude to Professor Yang and the fascinating team here at the CDCS and the Edinburgh School for organizing such a, you could say, exceptional symposium that serves to inspire and also advance the discussion on digital activism and resistance. And I very much look forward to, you could say, the conversation with you, as well as drawing inspiration from all of you. So my topic today is the dynamic of everyday politics, blind spots and opportunities in understanding digital activism and resistance. So I would like to start with a survey, and a survey with only one simple question that I would like to draw your input in this case. So I would like you to imagine yourselves as activists for the issues that concerns you the most. And I would like you to ask yourself, which digital technologies or applications would you adopt for activism and resistance? And it should be your thoughts on this question. So you can either go to the Menti with the code, or you can simply scan the QR code here. So we can take like 1 minute to see the answer. Okay, while you are still having your inputs at the same time, I think we can take a look at our answer together. So one of the very interesting things I would say is that the result is very, very diverse, right, in this case. So I think actually what we were doing right now, or what we are doing right now, is a fundamental aspect of digital activism and resistance. So an aspect that I argue has been largely overlooked in the current scholarship. So that is people's choice and selection. So we know that digital activism is first and foremost about people. So it's about individuals or groups leveraging digital technologies to bring about social, political, economic, or environmental change. So in this sense, we could ask which aspect of people's behavior demonstrate that they are exercising their agency, so the capacity of an actor in digital activism and resistance. Where can we observe and thereby study this agency, the capacity during people's encounters with digital technologies? And for me, one way of answering this question is to, as you can see from the title here, to think like an activist. And among many capacities we could identify during our encounters with digital technology, one fundamental aspect of agency we certainly must consider, just like what we are doing here, is the choice and selection made prior to the use of technologies. And now, I would like to turn to some real cases in this case. So we have seen plenty of examples all around the world where we say people are leveraging digital technologies or digital media like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, X, TikTok to push for social and political change. So generally speaking, it gives us a kind of impression that it appears to be a similar phenomenon across the world, that political activism and resistance are increasingly enabled, mediated, and facilitated by digital technologies. But I have identified an intriguing issue here. So in this slide, what we are going to see is the differences. It's the differences in the sense that the way in which people choose and adopt digital technology for activism and resistance across different events, contexts, and society, they are differences. So these differences, I argue, constitutes, you could say, is prenandas. So that is something that needs to be explored and explained. So start from top right, so you can see an image from the fair elections demonstration against electoral fraud in Russia's 2011 State Duma elections, and over 100,000 people involved in the demonstration. So I would like to know that, are any of you familiar with social media in Russia, or can you list the top 3 social media? Recontactor, that's the first one actually. And the second one, the logo, anyone identify that? Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks, Anna. So actually, Recontactor and Onoklasniki were the 2 top social media sites in Russia back to 2011. But I think Recontactor is also one of the top social media sites. But what is interesting here is Russians choose Facebook, which ranks number 5th, and Twitter, which was even lower to organize for fair election protest. So we could probably ask, why didn't they choose Recontactor in this case, which had actually around 5 times as many users as Facebook? And then the second case on your left-hand side is the Indignado movement in Spain. So that's another prominent case of activism. And what is interesting here is the movement not only used Facebook and Twitter, but they also use an independent social network called N1. So you can see a screenshot of N1 there. The website is unfortunately unavailable now, so I got the screenshot from the Internet Archive. And you can also see the website appear somehow kind of shabby, even by the standard of around 15 years ago, I could say. And the N1 had only 2,000 users before the camp. But then it turned out with a higher impact and also more users than many parties, political parties' website during the Indignado movement. So why then activists embrace Facebook, Twitter, and this specific website, N1, which has much, you could say, has such a small amount of users? And the last case in the right-hand corner is from the anti-extradition law amendment bill movement in Hong Kong between 2019 and 2020. So the movement predominantly adopted the messaging app Telegram and also a local Reddit-like forum called Liandeng. And again, it's particularly interesting to see the local actually adopt Telegram, because according to the description, Telegram is previously not very popular. And why didn't Hong Kongese, for example, use popular social media platform like YouTube, Instagram, or Facebook and WhatsApp, which were widely used in the earlier umbrella movement 5-year period? So similar to the question at the beginning of my talk, what interests me about this example is the selection, variation, and changes in adopting digital technologies for activism and resistance across different events, contexts, and society. So in other words, what factors foster or impel the choice and decision to adopt or reject a specific digital technology in activism and resistance? And these selections, variations, and change, and you could say essentially it's the choice and decision that people made are at the heart of politics, or you could say in our case that's contention politics. So thinking about social movement theory, so we have, for example, rational choice theories. We have discussion on tactical choice. James Jasper actually has this kind of statement, quote, almost every action of a protest group reflects an implicit or explicit choice. It could have been done differently. However, this topic remains somehow blind spot in the current scholarship of digital activism and resistance. So when talking about the general field of internet research, David Lassell and his co-authors criticized that, we see here quotation, quote, both basic population characteristic and underlying mechanism that structure user behavior on digital platforms remained relatively poorly understood. So using Twitter research as an example, they argue that the majority research make inferences about accounts or tweets, but they are unable to make statements about human behaviors and decision-making process. And moving to the scholarship of digital activism, what we can see is that the scholarship preoccupies with these consequences rather than the cause of adopting and using specific technologies in digital activism. And without exploring the reason behind people's choice and decision, so the adoption or utilization of specific technologies or application for activism is assumed to be obvious, to be nature or the only reasonable option without needing justification or debate. So in other words, you could say that means the choice and decision to use some technology but not others is taken for granted and self-evident, as if there were no need to consider alternative or question their appropriateness, which, as the earlier example shows, is not true in this case. And the other thing is that the term technology itself, or concretely speaking, terminology such as social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, has been treated as essentialistic and universal, often in an implicit way in existing scholarship. So when I say essentialistic and universal, I specifically refer to a lack of interest in the meanings and interpretations of digital technology. Or you could argue the diverse meanings and interpretations of, in some cases, even the same technology across time, situations, and contexts that could fundamentally underpin and shape its subsequent adoption and usage in political activism. But we already see, for example, anthropologists like Daniel Miller from UCL have made rich discoveries, which shows that the internet or the social media is not monolithic. And we also know that, for example, domestication theory, which is rooted in culture study of media use and informed by STS, science and technology studies, as well as the sociology of everyday life, So domestic theory also shows that how material objectives acquire different social meanings as they are incorporated into everyday experience. So this kind of disinterest, So this kind of disinterest in the meanings and interpretation of technologies lead to the concern that has been raised by Segbert and Bennett in their article talking about a risk. So to quote here, a risk that the defining political features of the technology may become assumed rather than discovered. And this subsequently leads to a failure to get a situated understanding of digital technology. So to address this blind spot, I suggest that we should reframe our question as the title here proposes. So what is to be done with digital technology? So the phrase "what is to be done" is from Lenin, and which has been widely referenced in political discussion regarding planning and organization for achieving social or political objectives. So while Lenin argues that the working class or the proletariat will not spontaneously become political and make a revolution, I want to adapt this term to emphasize that people or activists, they do not spontaneously take available digital technology simply for activism and resistance. So consequently, it's crucial to understand why they take the position they do with certain technology, but not others. So bear this in mind, it's crucial to remember Charles Tilly's remark on contentious performance or repertoire of contentions, which I will elaborate later. So the question that we should ask, so I think actually we are in a different scenario than Ashley's case where she talked about lack of resources. But in our case, we should ask in a media-saturated society, as research often describes it nowadays. So why do people, activists or claim makers, use some digital technology rather than others that could technically be possible for activism? So how do activists make choices and decisions? And what counts for the selection, variation, and change in the form of digital activism and resistance wherever it occurs? So to answer this question, I believe it requires acknowledging the relevance of everyday politics or everydayness in the discussion of digital activism and resistance. So here, the term everyday draws from the sociology of everyday life, which focuses on analyzing people's experience in their nature, everyday contexts. So this includes understanding the structure of relations created through daily encounters, in this case with digital technologies, and their associated meanings and feelings. And then the term politics is inspired by the discussion on the personal is political, which is used by student and feminist movements in Europe during the 1960s and 70s. So it emphasized how, you could say, personal and also everyday matters escalated to political significance in digital activism and resistance. So to combine these two concepts, I propose that everydayness or everyday politics is, or you could say should be, an integrated part of activism and resistance. So more importantly, it serves as both the benchmark and the foundation of activism and resistance. So the benchmark means here we use everydayness as a reference or standard against which we can observe and explain the specific ways in which people are sense-making, choosing and adopting digital technology for activism and resistance. So how to understand the relevance of everyday politics? So to unpack such kind of to unpack the relevance, in the discussion on digital activism and resistance, I believe there's more fundamental issue we are facing here. So what is technology? So Martin Heidegger actually addressed in his essay the question concerning technology that, quote, the essence of technology is nothing technological. So for Heidegger, the Greek term technique as the root of technology refers not only to products and tools that we are familiar with today, but also to the poetics and aesthetics of the mind. So in this sense, you could say techniques should be interrogated and reimagined in relation to the ontologies of communities. That community refers to different users, citizens, publics, or activists in this case. So following this argument, what technologies are for specific users and what these technologies can do depends on how they are related to a host of variables, including context, situation, place, and user. So given this, I actually find the term social technologies as used in several articles by Lance Burnett and Alexandra Segberg in their discussion on connective action and personalization of politics. I believe the term to be more precise for capturing such an understanding of digital technologies. However, Segberg and Burnett, they did not provide an explanation of this term in their work. Therefore, I will explicate it here, especially in a scenario of everyday life and activism and resistance. So fundamentally, the prefix social in social technology denotes that technologies are inherently social objective. Therefore, understanding their selections, variations, use, and non-use, as we observe in earlier cases of activism, is very crucial because they function as a social phenomenon. So the term social technologies thereby encompasses, you could say, three critical meanings here. So that's sociality, societal context, and social meaning of technology in everyday life. So that actually emphasizes the need to consider technology not only during the times of crisis, radical movement like activism, but also in their role in everyday life. So essentially, I argue that the term social technologies emphasized need to view the movements of activism and resistance through the lens of everyday social life. Why we say so? First, the term social indicates sociality. So that is the establishment and maintenance of human connections, both individually and in groups, through digital technologies. So social technology in this sense become naturalized as a venue for social interaction and expressive collectivity. So this perspective positions technology as a stage for social performance beyond its mere functional or instrumental use in activism, like mobilization and etc. Because the ways people choose and interact with technology in activism and resistance, for example, the patterns of adoption, choice, orientation around technologies, they reflect broader issues like people's sociality, collectivity, identity. For example, Professor Young's work on online political satire exemplifies how satire and humors serve not just as a form of resistance, but also as medias of sociality in this case. And this perspective further opens up the question or the discussion on what counts as activism and what does activism encompass in this case. And with it, we will acknowledge, we will recognize a range of activities as political and activist. And the second thing is technologies bears the mark of societal context in which they are used or not used, as well as how they are reinvented to support activist aspiration, values, and culture. So for example, in earlier cases of activism in Russia and Hong Kong, we observe norm use. Specifically, we talk about vContactor, we talk about Facebook or WhatsApp. And norm use often isn't as straightforward as it might seem. That means it's not necessarily due to inaccessibility, but rather a deliberate choice against certain contexts. If you look at the emerging study on digital disconnection, then you will see that argument. So this highlights the complex societal context, such as political, culture, economic arrangements, for example, that influence but do not dictate the availability and the appropriation of technologies. And the last point here is the contextual variation or variability of the social meanings of digital technology is very crucial. So what we see is that engagement with technology intertwines with the fabric of daily life, which often, you could say, diverse in unexpected way due to different, for example, informational and technological ecosystem within communities, organizations, cultures, and society. Accordingly, the internet or social media platform like Facebook or X holds diverse significance globally, and this reflects societal and temporal variations. So these complexities and diversities in social meaning, we could say guides, provokes, bias, control, and constraints social behavior for specific purpose. So this emphasizes the importance of understanding technology not just as tools, but also as embedded in everyday life practices and interpretations. So that's the idea of social technology, or the social part of that. And next, we explore the connection between social technologies and the repertoire of contention. So again, I would like to highlight the importance of everydayness to the repertoire of contention. So the repertoire of contention comes from Tilly's work, and the definition goes, quote, a limited set of routines that are learned, shared, and acted out through a relatively deliberate process of choice. So the research on repertoire of contention emphasized that such routines, they are deeply rooted in everyday social life. So accordingly, we could say there is a close relationship between everyday social life and activism and resistance. For example, Tilly and Taugo's work on urban insurrection discovered that such insurrection was associated with barricades, while the building of barricades originated as a byproduct of everyday experience. And there's another key point, which I believe is also largely overlooked in scholarship on digital activism and resistance. So it's the notion of a repertoire. So here, the notion of repertoire extends beyond the mere usage to include know-how. So if you look at Taro's discussion, so it's not only what people do when they are engaged in conflict with others, but what they know how to do and what others expect them to do. So the emphasis here is to understand not only the action undertaken during activism, but also this underlying knowledge and expectations. And this perspective invites us to look beyond what people do with technologies to consider the significance of everyday experience related to such know-how and knowledge of activism and resistance. So given this, understanding the dynamic of everyday life, everyday politics, share light on two critical aspects of activism and resistance. And these two aspects, you could say, are the analytical functions of the everyday politics as a benchmark. So first, digital technology as a repertoire of contention does not emerge from a vacuum, but there's limited discussion on this issue in existing literature. So which technologies or applications could be chosen as a repertoire of contention? And where do such repertoire come from? So that's the first thing. So connecting repertoire of contention to the everyday needs will allows us to pinpoint the capacity of agency in this case, which is exemplified by what James Jasper described as, quote, the art of selecting and applying tactics. So a key determination in an activist's selection of repertoire, according to Crossley, is their habits, their everyday sense of and grasp upon the world. So this highlights the importance of everyday needs as a benchmark for exploring the origins, the foundations, and selection of repertoire of contention. And the second thing is the meaning or the cultural meanings of specific technology as repertoire of contention. So here I argue that merely observing and starting the use is insufficient for comprehensively understand activism and resistance. And actions and their interpretation or their sense makings are two different things. So the distinction between actions and their interpretation is crucial for activism because meanings do not inhere in actions. So meaning are attributed to action through interpretation by individuals or various stakeholders. It is therefore essential to theoretically and analytically differentiate, for example, contention, action, activists from their interpretation, which I would say most scholarship does not recognize in this case. Thanks. So this is the concluding slides in this case. So that goes the proposed idea of how we could explore the relevance of everyday politics or everyday needs to our discussion on activism and resistance. So here, everyday needs serve as a benchmark to understand what James Jasper called taste in tactics, and I will elaborate that very soon in these slides. So turning the everyday politics into a benchmark and an analytical concept means the everyday needs is an integrated part of activism and resistance and should be considered as an essential subject of analysis in our discussion and digital activism. So if you look at the circle here, so you could say the gray part of the circle, that's the current scholarship or most of the current scholarship on digital activism and resistance. They have like focus on specific technology and they use in activism. What I propose here are two additional, yet I believe is essential aspects that draws on everyday needs. So the first thing is that we should explore everyday needs to map out the available repertoire of digital technology. Of course, Jesper talked about available repertoire, but I think in this case, in our specific scenario, it's about digital technologies. So we can do that through, for example, media ecologies and media repertoire approaches. So that returning to my early point, activists, they do not spontaneously adopt any available media or technologies for activism. So having digital technologies anytime, any space, any place, does not imply that any technology is suitable for digital activism and resistance in a specific context. So that's why we should move beyond this taken for granted assumption. So we should map the digital technologies in everyday life as a reference point for further interrogation of selection, use, and maybe non-use in this case. And the second part is the meaning of repertoire. Here, we need to incorporate the agency perspective. So that means we will focus on the meanings of technology. We will focus on, for example, selection, rejection, improvisation, appropriation in this case. And I also use the term affordance in this case, like Ashley already mentioned. So I think affordance and also another term, interpretive flexibility from HCI, human-computer interaction, they serve as a good way to identify two key issues. So one is relationality, the other is heterogeneity. So affordance could be understood, that's of course the traditional way, conventional way. Affordance could be understood as the relationality among users, technologies, materiality, and the context. So here, relationality suggests that, for example, choice, non-choice, use, non-use, they are relational, which requires us to sensitize ourselves to contextual factor in people's everyday life. Then interpretive flexibility indicates that each technology or technological artifact holds different sense-making and interpretation for various groups. So accordingly, we should avoid a universal understanding of even the same digital technologies in different activism and resistance across times, communities, culture, and society. So going back to the very first question, the survey that we did, you can see even we are talking about activism and resistance, then people's choice and decisions and also the meanings behind such kind of choice are very diverse. So these interpretations are not confined to the moments of activism. They are deeply rooted, shaped, and observable through everyday needs. And there's also a methodological implication of this proposal. And here I should acknowledge that's actually coming from the inspiration by my colleagues Matt here. So I believe that actually we must have two things to advance in the current scholarship on digital activism and resistance. That's comparative mindset and data and method triangulation. So this is, of course, not to say that we must conduct more comparative study of digital activism, though they are indeed relevant. But I think actually scholarship on digital activism and resistance could be strengthened with more comparative mindset or comparative perspective. That's comparative in the sense of, for example, temporal, cultural, geographical, everyday versus the moment of crisis, the moment of activism. And most scholars, including myself, I have to say, devoted so much energy to one case that we never move on to a second. But I think this is extremely relevant to have a comparative mindset. And adopting this comparative mindset allows us to think comparatively, for example, about why groups, individuals, and organizations make different choices. And it also allows us to ask questions differently in this case. And the next thing is triangulation, in the sense that we could combine different data or different methods in order to map out activism through the lens of everyday life. For example, we could use a survey or big data to map out people's daily use of media and technology, and then use ethnographical study to understand the meaning of specific technology in the moment of activism. So to conclude, considering everyday politics in the discussion on digital activism and resistance, avoid the assumption that using the internet or digital technology is a universal, taken for granted, and self-evident choice in activism. So instead, this approach recognizes that technologies emerge from complex and contest sets of values, beliefs, and practical knowledge embedded in everyday life, which underpins how claims can be made and articulate for activism and resistance. Thank you very much.
Would you like to sit at front? And we'll have time for a few questions for our two speakers. And I think we'd like to sit at front. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Jun Liu, for your thought-provoking keynote in thinking about blind spots in global digital activism and thinking critically about technologies themselves. So affordances seem to be a key word today, and we, of course, have the affordances of a microphone for the Q&A session. We are going to have a 20-minute Q&A session now. Just feel free to raise your hand, and we can have a conversation.
Well, my name is Wandari. I'm from Pepperdine University. My question is on what you just talked about. The last speaker, you said something like everyday moments of activism than moments of crisis. And we do know that a lot of digital activism, specifically, I come from Nairobi, Kenya, and specifically when Kenyans on Twitter are practicing what you call digital activism, it's mostly when there's a crisis. So my question is, how does that look like when you just look at everyday realities on digital platforms as opposed to moments of crisis?
Should we collect the questions or we just take them one by one? Okay. Yeah. I think my suggestion here actually is to contextualize the moment of activism in everyday life in order to get a better understanding. So for example, in your case, when you are talking about the way in which people use Twitter or X, and I'm wondering, it could be interesting to see if there's different or situated understanding of Twitter, for example, in the case of Kenya, that might be different from the way in which we understand Twitter, for example, in the States or in European countries. So that is an acknowledgement of this heterogeneity or diversities, even though we are talking about, you could say, seemingly like the same platform. But I would say we should avoid a kind of using such kind of a universal term like Twitter in this case, without a kind of contextualized understanding of the specific technology across different times, different communities, different societies. So that will be my response in this case.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. So I have a question for Araceli, and thank you. Really, this still about the repertoire and affordances. You didn't get to talk about repertoire, but if I remember, in your book, you did talk about the repertoire of activist affordances. And if I remember correctly, I could be totally wrong. I think your point is that I think Jun really emphasizes the kind of, there are a range of repertoire and activists or ordinary citizens you can choose from this whole range, seemingly quite strategically or freely. But in your case, my sense is that it's often out of absolute necessity, in a sense that there's not so much freedom of choice. You have to just maneuver, manage whatever is available. So my question, I guess, is in all these cases that you study, is there that sense of strategic kind of selection of repertoire, or really is still just making do with what is available, in the sense that it's really constrained situation, not much choice?
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation, Jun, as well. I'm learning a lot, and thank you for the question, Guobin. As I was listening to your talk, I noticed I'll come back to the question of constraints, but the term repertoire, I use it more grounded in performance studies, which has a very specific meaning in comparison to how you were using repertoire, which from what I hear from your presentation is more like a sociality and learning, a bit like habitus, but not so much habitus. There's a deliberate choice as well. Whereas in performance studies, repertoire, in the way Diana Taylor uses, is like, repertoires are like not like archives. Archives are what stays, like what are the government documents, like things that are written. Whereas repertoires are bodily repertoires. They are carried through the body. The way you learn through the body, you keep repeating it over time, it becomes your repertoire, just in the way a dancer, through training, acquires a repertoire and carries it through their practice. And that's how I use it in my work, because up until the final chapters of the book, I keep saying that these performances are ephemeral, they're passing, and yet, as you keep living with disability, as you repeat them over and over again, you craft it like an artist, and it becomes your repertoire that you carry with you. You don't think about it anymore. You come into a room, you know how to navigate through those constraints with almost like artfulness. It flows through. It's so repertoire. Actually, all these activist affordances, dances, as much as they seem fleeting or momentary, they stay. They stay in the body. They stay in the environment. They change your living space. Go into disabled persons, or come into my home. You will see that there's a repertoire that almost left its traces in the way I organize my furniture, in the way my kitchen cabinets are organized. These environments carry the traces of how my body moves, how my partner's body moves together with me. So we created another home, like softening the hard edges of furniture, making it to fit to our bodies, that constraining aspects of the environment. That's how I see it. But I'm really interested also in this interesting parallel between our conversation and on this question of, what I'm hearing from you, Jun, is that this notion of interpretive flexibility, perhaps somewhat having too many choices, having a sort of an abundance of technologies, and users navigate themselves, make choices, do non-use. And whereas in the disability and shrinking case is that there's not much flexibility, there's not much choice. It's actually more and more the question of scarcity. So I kind of wonder about that. How would interpretive flexibility work out in the cases of shrunkenness, and would that be much room for navigating that? That's the question I ask myself too. That's how I see about this lack of choices and availability of technologies in different parts of the world, speaking back to the question of heterogeneity. Thank you.
Dr. Dokumachi, we'll go to the next question.
Thank you. Thank you both for inspiring talks. And my question is for you, Asli. And it is about, it was amazing how you lifted the resourcefulness of your participants and showed how they danced with the constraints that they are facing. But I was wondering, when you also showed what from their ways of being resourceful and imagining and coming up with different ways of doing and world making, you had also those infrastructural aspects, like the tools that could be there and should be there. So lifting, or what is necessary, what do we need to acknowledge their individual ways of world making on a structural level that acknowledges the capabilities, the different capabilities in a way, and makes them possible and supports them in their resourcefulness, but not leaving them with their individual solutions that are impressive and necessary, but the collective, the structural level. And it's also the kind of absence of maybe a presence of those responsible for infrastructure, for example, and that all is supposed to be accessible and made accessible and so on. So how to lift, how to make this connection?
Thank you so much, Anna, for that question. I think it's so important, and it was something that I included in the book as I moved towards the final chapters, because it's such a politically dangerous argument to make at these times of austerity measures, neoliberal privatization of public services, including services for disabled people. So when I argue that disabled people make do, they create, it doesn't mean that let's get rid of them, right? It's totally not that argument. And I can see how it can be appropriated easily by some, like, I don't know, policymaker. Oh, they're fine anyway, let's not give them anything. That's not the point. The point is thinking about disability as a form of like hopefulness and still being able to go on as a valuable life. And like, even when you have nothing, if things are so constrained, even when you're just left with your body, you can still try. And there is something important in that hopefulness, in that like struggle for survival. That's what I wanted to uplift. Whereas saying that these infrastructures, these necessities, these services are needed. You know, they are absolutely needed. They are two separate arguments. They're absolutely needed. The fact that people create activist affordances doesn't mean that it should be left on their shoulders. It just means that when everything is taken away from you, you can still, like, you know, try to make disabled life as a good life. So that's a counter-argument to that, actually. And another aspect I still want to say is that, like, the technologies that are like assistive devices and like tools that are invented and given, and sometimes they don't work because they are not, you know, designed together with the actual needs of disabled people, together with them. That's an argument that is made in disability studies too. Sorry, I'm too fast. I have those like curved, elongated comb that was given to me actually in Denmark. Imagine, like, all the, that they were nice, but I never used them myself. I just cut my hair short, like, and then it's just, also it makes you think, like, how much of them are really needed and how much of them are just more and more production that might end up becoming waste, that might end up becoming, you know, staying in our cupboards that we never use. I mean, bunch of plastic waste, basically. That's another question that also needs to be asked, I think. Yeah.
Thank you so much both for your wonderful talks. I have two questions. The first question is for Dr. Dokmachi. I love your book. Guobin made us read for his class. It's a wonderful book. My question is regarding the idea of repertoire. So when Taylor discussed repertoire, she says it's about bodily co-presence of knowledge transmission. And you also mentioned how activist affordance can scale across and scale up. So I'm wondering, like, what do you see are the cases? Because most of your participants, when you give examples, it seems like they improvise by themselves or with people around them. And I'm wondering what are the cases that you are thinking about to scale across this affordance, even beyond the disabled community, to cases you mentioned like climate change. And also, like, do you see this transformation of learning the repertoire as a linear and destined process, or it could be like back and forth and very fragmented? And my question for Dr. Liu is that, given the idea about repertoire again, do you see the possibility of a shrinkage again when people choose what they know how to do with the technology? I'm thinking about the case of authoritarian countries, when it's less about how many options you have, but more like a necessity of this is what you have, and you have to deal with it with what you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful question. Thinking about the scaling of repertoires across, I think my desire for writing this book, because that these things happen in our corners, in our very much everyday lives, in our homes, like domestic spheres or rarely in public, and that we are not able to communicate this across. But what if people know each other's of activist affordances, these very micro gestures? That was the desire behind the book. And I do believe books have affordances too, because once this was out, people were writing back to me and saying, exactly, I do have my affordances, do you want to know them? So there is the scaling up. There's so many stories of doing this activism on people's hidden corners that they want to share and bring to the world out there, but they are not connected, like, because, you know, mostly out of sight and not spectacular, right? They are hidden. So I do think that, you know, the idea is really having a critical eye to be able to recognize these, to be able to identify these activist affordances and putting them in conversation. You're not alone in your home doing it. There are so many others like you. And imagine if we all knew each other. How would that be, how would that be not like a form of revolution? True from the ground, very from the micro, from this very nitty-gritty, again, going back to personal, political, and feminist struggles, like everything from the ground up, like empirical details. And in terms of the repertoire, you're absolutely right. It's not linear. It's, as you beautifully put, it's fragmented back and forth and not easy, I believe, from my own experience. A lot of negotiations. It's not always happy. There are like also moments of grief and despair. It might appear as if it was like, oh, they are all joyful, but there were moments of like also feeling grief that I didn't include because there's heavy editing behind the video too. There is that aspect that needs to be recognized, that there are difficulties, there are negotiations, complexities and contradictions. It takes a lot of effort to develop that repertoire. Yeah, I'll pass it on.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely relevant question. For me, I would say, actually, if we go back to the discussion on repertoire, I think for one thing, repertoire talk about like routine, everyday life, habitus. But at the same time, I think TD, but also other scholars also identify what they call the innovation of the repertoire. So that is where I think we see a new, you could say, contention or new ways of contentions performance emerge. And that's the exactly reason that I believe the everydayness is relevant for us as a benchmark, as I say. Without the benchmark, we will not be able to, you could say, recognize, or we will not be able to identify such kind of innovation. You could say, for example, taking, we could say, the case of the anti-extradition law amendment movement in Hong Kong as an example. You could, to a certain degree, you could see, I think, the use of Telegram and the adoption of Liandeng, somehow you could say it's a kind of deviating behavior in this case. So I think that's extremely relevant both to observe the habitat side of repertoire, but at the same time also to observe those deviant cases where we can see the innovation of repertoire, maybe not just in the case of authoritarian regime, but also in other scenarios in this case. Thanks.
Just to be cognizant of time, we have 4 or 5 minutes left, so maybe it will be beneficial to collect all the questions and then Dr. Dokumachi and Dr. Liu could answer. Okay. Thank you.
Dr. Liu, this question is for you, and I was wondering, in thinking about digital activism specifically, where the physical or like the everyday in-person bits end and digital activism starts, and it's never that sort of clean or clear binary, but I'm thinking about how at some of the early examples you mentioned, right? Like how in Russia, in Hong Kong, in Spain, your work has pointed to the ways that the everyday outside of the digital influences the kinds of tools that are used in the digital.
We have a few questions over there.
Thank you for these wonderful presentations. I have a question for Dr. Dokumachi, and it's a related question with that question about scalability. I especially was really struck by your concept of people as affordance and how these moments of sociality, how these moments of encounters, it really brings this relational ethics of connections and how these connections could really broaden our imaginations of recognizing what is missing, what is absent, and also thinking about like how can we design better infrastructures, better services. I wanted to hear a little bit more about these moments of encounters, because it's also moments when people are putting themselves out and being open about their vulnerability. It's also very risky moments. I believe that they would have a lot of anxiety about asking for help, but it's also a moment where these solidarities could be incubated. So I wanted to hear more about how these could be opportunities of scalability. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is also to Professor Dokumachi. Towards the end, you mentioned the sort of conjuncture developing of climate change and inhabiting disability in our bodies. If you could say a little more about that, because the scales of politics of care and the causalities of damages are so drastically different. I'm curious, how far do you want to see that conjuncture developing? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the this kind of waking up presentations. I have a question for Dr. Jun Liu. I was wondering how you might understand the everyday embeddedness of digital technology, and especially in like how the political economy aspect plays upon it. Like I was thinking about the case of Korea and China, where digital platforms are very, very much like central, and they become almost like an infrastructure in countries. So how do you incorporate that into the everydayness as your concept of everydayness? And I think you briefly touched upon this with the case of Hong Kong, about how some people who kind of intentionally avoid these kind of everyday technologies because they think that it could be an oppressive structure for them. So I'm kind of curious how you kind of understand these instances where it's not just about repertoire, but also about people trying to avoid or create their own rooms for making activism happen.
My question for Dr. Maki. I was curious about, I don't know if you know the occupational status of the people in your video. I don't know if it matters, but I was struck by a lot of the video was them doing food preparation, and I think that was very evocative. But I'm just curious about how, are they self-advocates? Do they work as advocates? And if they don't, what is your thinking about putting on the label of activism for disability? I personally do think that being disabled in society is kind of a form of activism, but I don't know if everyone agrees with that. So I just was hoping to hear more of your thinking about describing those individuals as activists as such.
Do we have any more questions? Okay.
So I just briefly respond to the two excellent questions. So the first question, I think that's an excellent one. I think that will return back to my point in the presentation, saying that actually what counts as activism in this case. That's also resonate with Ashley's wonderful ethnographical work, because usually I think that's also relevant in the sense that why we have to think like activists, because some cases we have a priority or preference to look at those what you could call those moments of significance, those extraordinary moments, and taken for granted that they are the most relevant part of social movement, like Professor Yang mentioned at the beginning of this symposium. So, but I think actually to activism, so they may have a different interpretation, understanding. And then again, going back to the idea of everydayness, in this case, I would say everydayness, they influence the activism and resistance, but they do not dictate the moment of activism in this case. And we see a lot of contingencies in people improvise and performs in a certain moment as part of their repertoire. So I think that should be a relevant dimension to acknowledge. And the other thing is going back to I think the question of political economy is also an extremely relevant point. But I think what I see actually from my perspective, the commonality or one of the commonality that we all talk about is to emphasize the relevance of agency in this case. So in your case, is agency in the scenario of resources less, where in my cases, I would say, when we talk about media saturated society, it's more like a resources rich, circumstances kind of scenario where people make deliberate choice. For me, I would say to acknowledge or to identify the agency is extremely relevant, or as the first step to move towards the understanding of the relationship between agency and structure. So in other words, you could say in some cases, my concern will be the discussion on political economies or infrastructure serving as a very abstract idea, where it's sort of lack of the connection to the agency, the capacity of the actor. So that's why without identifying the actor or agency, it's very difficult to discuss the structure, for example, in your case, as an infrastructure thing. So that's why I think it's relevant not to deny the relevance of infrastructure or political economy, but actually rather through the lens of agency in order to pinpoint, for example, which kind of structural element could be relevant socially, economically, politically in this case. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the questions. They're so wonderful and makes me think more. I will just start maybe with the last question because it right away links and then move backwards. I do agree that, with you, Jun, like this idea of what counts as activism and who gets to do activism, who is it afforded to? Do people have to be self-identified as activists to be doing activist work? And that's something I want to also challenge. How can we think of activism out of its traditional boundaries? And also in a transnational scale, like thinking of disability activism through a transnational scale too. When I find my participants, I was deliberately not looking for I didn't say that you should be self-identified disabled people. I was open to anyone, and most of my participants in Turkey wouldn't even know the category of disability or wouldn't even know how to identify with it, because such identity categories don't exist with the people I interviewed, whereas some of the people in Quebec were more exposed to such language of advocacy, perhaps, being part of organizations. And I think there's importance in that, because we can pluralize the languages of activism and beyond certain North America-based identity focused forms of activism, which done so much important work. But what about who are we leaving out? Who might be doing other forms of activism, even if when they don't even know the word, even if when they are not identifying as such and such. And yet they are building up the worlds they want to see, which is what activism is also about. It doesn't always have to be about big policy changes, being on the street, which is not something that not everybody can afford, especially when you're chronically ill, etc. So I think there's a desire on both of our parts. I sense this desire to pluralize the language of activism. What counts as activism, who gets to do it, which actions counts as activism. So I'm hoping that could speak to your question. And in terms of the question about scalability, that's really important. And when it comes to discussions around climate catastrophe, there's also big debates about the macro changes and the micro changes. When you say, oh, go and do recycle, and then you're fine, you're doing well for the planet. And this could fall into that argument too, and I thank you for that, because I think it's something that needs to be straightened out. There are many levels and scales at which actions against climate catastrophe needs to be taken, and there are, of course, macro level changes that needs to be stricter regulations, law needs to work better, corporations had to be accountable, everything. But then there are other scales as well, and what I'm thinking that what I'm learning from my participants and disabled people, chronically ill people, is that this idea of this ability of being aware of you're living in very limited resources, and you're developing a keen awareness of limitedness, and you're acting with responsibility and care towards those limited resources, whether it's your body or the environment. And I think that's responsibility is the key. That is also coming from feminist climate Anthropocene scholars, that responsibility that exists in these activist affordances, because you're so careful of what is left so little, you act ethically. I'm hoping that's the thing that can come out of these discussions of how to scale up. And I think your question, which is so important about people as affordances, which you beautifully put as, if you think about these moments of vulnerability, opening up, telling your need for care, can it be, instead of seeing it as a shame, can it be an opportunity for scalability? Exactly, I think it's so important, because I myself, I'm shy of asking for help. Imagine, I wrote about it, but what if you think of it as an opportunity for building communities? And one example I give is the image of dancers on stage. It's when they hold up each other, when they carry, when they lift, when they touch, it's not help. They are working in choreography in tandem. And what if we think of living together and helping each other out through, I will be your affordance, and I know that next moment you could be my affordance in a way I cannot understand, even if I look able-bodied. Maybe you're giving me an affordance that I don't even know. So what if we approach it this reciprocity of same way dancers move on in stage, rather than thinking of this help or whatever as one-way street, you're always one giver, the other one is always a taker, which has been criticized in care literature already. But thank you for asking the questions, all the questions, and thinking together with us.
Thank you, Dr. Arceli Dokumachi and Dr. Jun Liu, and thank you everyone for a generative Q&A session. I'm now going to invite Dr. Guobin Yang to wrap up today's session.
We're late for dinner. But that's because the presentations was just so inspiring, so rich, and I'm sure we have a lot more questions. But luckily, we have a whole day tomorrow, over breakfast, over lunch, during coffee breaks, and as well as in the presentations here. So the conversations will continue, and one change in our plan, the change of venue. All the events tomorrow will be here. Originally, it was going to be downstairs, but we changed plans, so all the panels will be here. Tomorrow lunch, I think, will be downstairs, and we'll direct you. All the speakers and moderators, you're invited to a dinner at Han Dynasty, 3711 Market Street. This is about 10 to 15 minutes of walk from here. Let's walk fast. We're a little late. And then with that, we'll close. Thank you, everyone, again. Thank our speakers.